Before I begin, I would like to say a special message to my Mara, the dearest person in my life. Mara, first off, I wish you a very happy birthday. 26 isn't a big year, but it's big to me that we've now spent 5 birthdays together. 5 years of being next to wonderful you. We've had ups and downs, and I've probably made you upset by accident on more occasions than I would care to remember, if I could. Through it all, you have stuck by me and been the kindest, most thoughtful person in my life. You put up a lot with what I do on a daily basis, and I will never be able to express how thankful I am to you, be it letting me sleep every day after I come home from work, or making me get up and go out with your friends and family. Through it all, I know I have become a better person, and I cannot, will not ever be able to express that to you in enough ways. I hope that this is a big way, though, that I can show you how much I love you. That, and I'd like you to listen to something other than,
Her legs were cut off. Her arms were cut off. Her eyes were gouged out. Her body parts were strewn across 6 states and took federal investigators 8 years to find.
I love you, Mara. From Conrad. I would have picked a book you enjoy, but all that you have is manga, so I thought this would be the next best thing, since you know I'll enjoy reading every bit of it. To anyone who's not Mara and is therefore a bum, I made this as a special present to the most precious person in my life. I hope that you, too, dear listener, enjoy my slightly nasally, slightly lispy voice. I plan on reading through this whole book as an audiobook, but we will see, and only time will tell if I make it all the way through. One additional note as you begin reading. I sincerely apologize for any butchering or mispronunciations of any countries, names, or words in general. World War II Infographics by Jean Lopez, Nicholas Aubin, Vincent Bernard, and Nicholas Gillerat, with a foreword by Jonathan Fenby. Forward. World War II was the most devastating conflict ever fought on our planet, with consequences felt to the present day. The previous confrontation between the great powers from 1914 to 1918 had been dubbed the War to End All Wars, but the struggle which followed 2 decades later between the Axis nations headed by Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allies led by the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain, was far wider, more destructive, more ideological, and more world-changing, not only on its military fronts, but also in its effects on both the global balance and on society and human relationships. The battlegrounds themselves stretched from the far north of Europe to South Pacific, with fighting of a scale not seen before on land, sea, and in the air. The combined armed forces of the 30 belligerent nations numbered 130 million, topped by 34 million in the Soviet Union, 18 million in Germany, and 16 million in the United States. Between 20 and 25 million military personnel were killed, but the civilian toll was even larger in total warfare, in which indiscriminate killing rode roughshod over old conventions as ideology and doctrines of racial superiority added a deadly edge to the military struggle. In all, anywhere from 70 to 85 million people lost their lives as a result from the struggle for mastery between fascism, communism, and democracy, in which victory was the only option. The material destruction was unparalleled. Warfare became industrialized as never before, as the economic weight of the Allies grew and the Axis powers sought desperately to augment their resources. Leading combatant nations mobilized their entire populations using propaganda on an unprecedented level. The deployment of new weapons changed the nature of conflict. Heavy bombers, tanks, rockets, and aircraft carriers amongst them, and then the atom bombs dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, governments boosted technological advances in radar, computing, communications, medicine, and other fields, which would help shape the post-war world. In many nations, morality broke down and social cohesion fragmented, even as state control was increased. Occupation by foreign armies imposing their political systems set resistance partisans and collaborators with the invaders against one another. Terror was used on and often indiscriminate scale, and the Nazis made their concentration camps into factories of death in pursuit of the final solution to eliminate Jews and others they classified as subhuman. The struggle for survival predominated. Human life became cheap. Powerful leaders set on ultimate victory had no time for compromise. When the fighting finally ended, old empires were on their knees, and two great powers, new to global leadership, faced one another in a fresh confrontation that would last for almost another half century. The driving forces of the war were both simple and complex. The Axis powers were intent on expansion, on challenging the Western victors of World War I, and saw force as the way to achieve that. They were greatly aided by the reluctance of other nations to oppose them, whether from weakness or from fear of reigniting the bloodbath of the earlier conflict. Peacekeeping organizations set up after 1918 to police the globe proved ineffective in a world which nationalism took the upper hand. At several points, the geopolitical equation that led to full-scale global war might have gone in another direction had the political calculus between Berlin, London, Paris, Moscow, Washington, and Tokyo taken on a different dimension. But, given the nature of the principal protagonists and the interests they championed, conflict was virtually inevitable. In Europe, it is common to focus as a starting date on September 1939, when Britain and France declared war on Germany after its forces had invaded their treaty partner, Poland, and then on the Nazi regime's all-conquering advance to the west the following summer that brought the defeat of France in the third war between the two countries in 70 years. But German resentment at the Versailles Treaty imposed on it after World War I and Hitler's ambitions to make his country master of the continent had pointed to war well before this, as Germany reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland, carried out the Anschluss with Austria, and then dismembered Czechoslovakia after the Munich Agreement of 1938. On the other side of the globe, Japan had seized China's most industrialized region of Manchuria in 1931 and established a puppet state there before expanding its zone of influence and then launching full-scale war against the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek in 1937. Mussolini's Italy, for its part, had invaded Ethiopia in 1935, while the civil war in Spain saw German, Italian, and Soviet involvement. The USSR had concluded its pact with Germany in 1939, as Stalin and Hitler chose to put the chances of territorial expansion in Eastern Europe ahead of their ideological differences, though the German invasion of the USSR 2 years later would show the Nazi leaders' true intentions. As war spread across Europe with the German Blitzkrieg of 1940, the defeat of France, and the isolation of Britain facing a Nazi-dominated continent, the United States was still bound by the isolationism that it had embraced after the end of World War I. For all his domestic political strength, Franklin Roosevelt felt the need to move carefully towards committing his country to engage in the fight against fascism. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, followed by Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, brought the world's most powerful economy out of isolation to assume the international role it had previously refused to engage in, a two-front war as Tokyo forces surged through Southeast Asia, humiliating European colonial powers and making the conflict truly global. This sequence of events, some connected, others the result of unilateral decisions by individual governments, ensured that the conflict, which would last until the summer of 1945, would be worldwide in nature. In keeping with that scale, it was marked on land by huge military campaigns in Europe and Asia, at sea by great maritime battles between aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and the struggle between vital supply convoys to Britain and German U-boats in the Atlantic, and in the air by the deployment of bomber forces in mass raids on cities, culminating in the dropping of atomic weapons on Japan. The size and complexity of the armed forces involved required unprecedented levels of organization, which changed the nature of warfare. The backing of populations on the home front was vital as grand strategy was implemented by a unique cast of leaders, headed by Roosevelt, Stalin, Hitler, and Churchill, each of whom sought to personify their nation, as did resistance standard bearers such as Gall and Tito. The course of events to the defeat of Germany and Japan in the summer of 1945 produced huge battles, stretching across Europe from the Red Army's advance on Berlin to the west of the continent after the D-Day invasion of Normandy, and raging across the Pacific as the Imperial Japanese forces were pushed back towards their home islands. Germany's threat to North Africa and the Middle East had been beaten off, and success in the Battle of the Atlantic ensured that Britain would be able to fight on, though economically drained by 6 years of combat. In contrast to the Axis powers, which never coordinated policy to any significant degree, Roosevelt and Churchill met regularly and held two summits with Stalin at Tehran and Yalta to maintain their joint front, even if their ambitions for the post-war world increasingly diverged as the Soviet dictator pursued his goal of carving out a deep security zone in Eastern and Central Europe under Moscow's control. Thousands of historical accounts have been devoted to the war, dealing with everything from detailed examination of individual battles to the sweep of grand strategy, from the politics of the opposing leaders to the plight of civilians caught in the bloodlands of Europe and Asia. In addition, there has been a stream of films, documentaries, novels, and television dramas set in the war years, ensuring that the legacy of the conflict remains a potent force, be it in British pride at standing alone in 1940, Chinese antagonism towards Japan, or the never again horror of the Holocaust. This volume presents a new approach, using infographics to provide readers with an analytical picture of how the conflict took shape and how it was fought, with specific building blocks on the many different elements that contributed to that. That enables it to embody a massive amount of information in an easily accessible form which, taken together, offers a unique panorama of the most massive war the world has ever seen. Jonathan Fenby. Preface. More books have been written about World War II than hours have passed since it ended, and that tidal wave of paper is nothing compared to the sea of data produced by institutions, including the armed forces, ministries, governments, embassies, commissions, agencies, committees, offices, missions, businesses, and think tanks that were involved in the greatest conflict of all time. War causes death, destruction, and suffering, but above all it generates statistics. A complete list of data sources on the American oil industry between 1940 and 1945 alone would not fit into this book. In the post-war period, these mountains of data were then used as a basis for further research on various aspects of the war, and in turn were added to our stock of knowledge, and so on, ad infinitum. The aim of this book is to create a better understanding of World War II. In embarking on this project, we felt like geologists going down into an inexhaustible data mine to collect tiny but relevant samples. Once cross-checked, confirmed, and calibrated, these were used to expand on the 53 topics covered here. We must point out that this was just one of many possible choices. Many aspects of the war have been omitted, geographical areas ignored, major operations not mentioned. For instance, we have not always given as much attention as we should to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, to women, factory workers, neutral countries, or to the world of intelligence and special operations. Regretfully, a long list of subjects had to be left out, but we were obliged to be selective, or else the volume of data collected by the three authors and processed by just one data designer within the 3 years we spent on our research would have been unmanageable. The massive amount of data we gathered needed to be presented in an attractive, concise, and intelligent way. My thanks are due to Nicholas Gillerat for his skill in designing the infographics and maps to flesh out the statistics. In this graphic form, economic, demographic, and military data no longer appears dry and abstract,
but this is not a picture book in which you are encouraged to skip from one illustration to the next. It is a real history book designed to be read, albeit in a different way. Each of the 357 maps and graphs contain a mass of information representing different levels of understanding and analysis, and the reader can choose between them. On the topic of aircraft production, for instance, you might simply read that the USA, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union had overall superiority over the Axis countries. But if you want to go into the topic in more detail, you can see the national specializations in each sector, production rates, technical choices, and transfers of equipment between the Allies. We hope this will make the book appealing to those new to the subject as well as those with more of a specialized interest. And special thanks to the research of my co-authors, Nicholas Auburn and Vincent Bernard. The sources quoted at the end of each section are international and very carefully chosen. Keeping track of such a mass of often incomplete or contradictory statistics is quite an achievement. This book is more than just an aid memoir or a database. It is also a source of deeper information, discoveries, surprises, and challenges to our knowledge of the most horrific event of the 20th century. Looking at the illustrations here of American, British, and Soviet production, or, to take another example, comparative losses in the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Atlantic, you might well answer the question of whether World War II was a close-run thing differently. Did Churchill exaggerate the risk of an Axis victory in his memoirs in order to inflate his own and his country's stature? Looking at the command diagrams, you might also make you reassess the view that a totalitarian dictatorship is necessarily more efficient at fighting a war than a liberal democracy. Issues like these are raised under most of the subject headings. By taking a fresh approach to this hugely significant event, we have tried to show it in a different light. Jean Lopez. Chapter 1. The Context of the War. The Fall of Democracy in Europe. The interwar period was the darkest point in the history of European democracy. After a century of victories, it was under attack from authoritarian, military, and totalitarian regimes. Democracy's downfall started in Hungary in 1920, followed by regime changes in Italy, Poland, Lithuania, Portugal, and Yugoslavia. After 1930, the global economic crisis weakened and disoriented the middle classes, leading to a second wave of right-wing extremism in which national resentments and the radicalization of disaffected minorities also played a major role. Everywhere, the emergence of openly anti-democratic parties went hand in hand with the growth of ideologies and values that echoed those that had held sway until 1914. The cult of personality, militarism, aggressive nationalism, veneration of the all-powerful state, anti-individualism. The creation and apparent success of new types of state, such as the USSR, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany, encouraged the widespread rise of these anti-establishment parties. Verbal and physical political violence became commonplace. An increasing number of anti-Semitic laws were passed, and wild territorial claims were staked, usually in military terms. Dollfuss, Erzberger, Rathenow, Matteotti, Piraki, Alexander of Yugoslavia, Granjo, Duka, and Stamboliyski were just a few of the hundreds of political figures that were assassinated. Around 1920, 24 European governments could be considered democratic. If the USSR and, for other reasons, the microstates are left out of the picture, only Albania and Hungary did not have free elections. By 1938, the number of democracies had been reduced to 11. Czechoslovakia, Finland, Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland. The abandonment of Czechoslovakia by the two major Western democracies in the 1938 Munich Agreement was seen by all European democrats as a terrible betrayal, unforgivable in the context of this retreat into the past. Nonetheless, France and Britain could justifiably claim to be on the side of democracy when the war broke out in September 1939. Their enemy, Germany, was a totalitarian regime backed by two other equally totalitarian states, Italy and the Soviet Union. Caught between the three, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans all gave up the ideals of free elections and a free press, the rule of law and equality for all their citizens. And the worst was yet to come. 6 of the democracies surviving in 1938 succumbed in their turn in 1942. It was truly the midnight of the century.
Economic forces. Does victory depend on economic strength? In the first phase of the war, from 1939 to mid-1942, military factors predominated. Surprise, speed, training, tactics, motivation, and arms stockpile before the war gave the advantage to the Axis. That did not mean, of course, that economic factors had no effect on their victories. After all, their combined GDPs were 3/4 the size of those of their enemies. At the end of 1940, after the victory over Western Europe and with the French Empire out of the picture, the GDP of the Rome-Berlin axis was even theoretically 1/4 higher than that of the British bloc. Everything changed when, after 24 months in the case of the Reich and 6 months in the case of Japan, the Axis countries proved unable to win and found themselves trapped in a war of attrition. In the second phase of the war, the Allies had had time to remedy their most serious military weakness, and economic power became crucial once again. The scale, quality, and diversity of American and Soviet resources, combined with those of the British bloc, and with the addition of those provided, willingly or otherwise, by Latin American and Middle Eastern countries, crushed everything that could be put in their way. In 1942, the GDP of the Allies was twice that of the enemy. In 1944, over 3 times. At the beginning of 1945, over 5 times. This economic imbalance was made worse by differences in the size of mobilization populations, access to key strategic resources, energy, non-ferrous metals, and unexploited production reserves. In this regard, the figures opposite are slightly distorted by the reference year chosen, usually 1938. In that year, Roosevelt's America was going through another crisis after the improvements of the New Deal, with its GDP falling to $800 billion. Enormous agricultural, industrial, and mining resources were underutilized, whereas those of Japan, Germany, and Italy were working at full capacity. The mobilization of unused labor and production capacity, including 10.3 million unemployed, is made plain by a single figure. In 1945, the GDP of the United States was 84% higher than in 1938. Even with pillaging and forced labor, the Reich could only achieve an increase of 24%, and Japan 11%. Figure 1. Levels of economic development. The economic development of the two sides can be measured in various ways. In the Axis camp, only the German Reich rivaled Britain and the United States in the size of its industrial sector and the scale of its research and development, as evidenced by its ability to partly catch up in the field of radar and take the lead in developing jet aircraft and missiles. Italy, Japan, and the USSR were considered developing countries, with a large and fairly unproductive agricultural population and limited technology. The British and the Americans could spend 1/4 of their expenditure on aircraft, whereas the Soviets, Italians, and Japanese still had enormous infantries. Figure 2. GDP, area, population in 1938. Although on paper the war might appear to be a race for resources, with the Axis partly managing to make up for its deficits, this is misleading. The Axis powers had very little success in exploiting the reluctant populations and the economies of the countries they controlled, crippled by blockades. Hitler believed that, in order to win, he needed to take over all of the Soviet Union's resources, which did not happen.
He also saw this as the key to continental expansion, with its associated strategic advantages. The Japanese were in the same mind. It was strange that two major Axis allies nevertheless did not make it a priority to unite for this purpose. Figure 3. Key products in percent of world production, 1939. This list of 15 products, not including oil, that were crucial to victory shows the imbalance between the two sides. Even in the case of basic materials such as steel, the German Reich and Japan did not have the means to achieve their ambitions. They were constantly required to decide between the demands of the three armed forces. From 1942 onwards, the Reich survived on its stock of some metal alloys. The Allies only had issue with access to natural rubber after the Japanese took control of the rubber plantations in Asia. However, the US managed to develop a huge synthetic rubber industry in 18 months, catching up on the lead the Reich had before the war. Figure 4. Agriculture. One of the major concerns for leaders of countries at war is access to food, especially grains and cereals. In fact, Hitler could be said to have been obsessed with the threat of famine. Apart from Romania, all of the countries with a surplus were on the Allied side. Britain was much more dependent on wheat imports than any other country, hence the idea of causing a famine by waging a submarine war on its trade. The Reich fed its citizens by starving millions in the Soviet Union, Poland, France, and Belgium. Figure 5. Key industries. Germany's thriving chemicals industry enabled it to meet the demand for gunpowder and explosives until 1944. Japan and the USSR had greater difficulties. As well as having fewer chemical plants, they also lacked modern oil refineries. The ability to motorize and mechanize forces, critical in Europe where ground combat took place on a large scale, was directly dependent on a huge motor industry, as well as oil resources. Much of the German army was still horse-drawn, while its Western opponents were extensively mechanized. The USSR only managed to make up for the shortfall by using American supplies. 1 in 9 mobilized. Of the 2.2 billion people living in the world in 1939, nearly 130 million people, 4% of them women, from 30 countries were mobilized in the Second World War. Around 70% of these were on the Allied side, with the rest on the Axis side. The largest numbers in absolute terms came from the USSR, the United States, China, and the German Reich. The proportion mobilized relative to the total male population was highest in the Reich, Italy, and the USSR. In Germany, the mass conscription of 18 to 50-year-olds was supplemented by 9 million foreign workers, most of them not volunteers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp prisoners. In the USSR, mobilization was too high, causing the civil economy to come close to collapse by 1942, especially since 62 million of the population remain under German occupation. Troops were mustered from Romania twice, with 1.2 million Romanians fighting on the Axis side until September 1944. After that, nearly 600,000 fought on the Soviet side. China was a special case. Some of the 14 million people mobilized between 1937 and 1945 never saw a weapon, let alone a Japanese opponent. Others disappeared as soon as they left the conscription office. Some only fought against other Chinese people, communists. No record was kept of the forces mobilized by the communists. The figures below only give a partial picture of the situation in Yugoslavia and in France. The Yugoslav army swept aside by the Wehrmacht in a few days in April 1941 theoretically numbered 1 million men, but others were later called up to serve the Croatian state of Ante Pavelic or Tito's forces. How many of the 5 million mobilized in France in 1940 were also included in the 1.3 million recruited by Charles de Gaulle in 1944-45? There are no reliable figures. Conscription from the male population in Britain was limited from 1942 onwards in order not to paralyze the economy. From 1943 onwards, 10% of all British conscripts, known as the Bevan Boys, after the government minister Ernest Bevan, were sent to work in coal mines. To avoid the risk of military shortfall, Britain conscripted from its colonies, sometimes, as in the case of New Zealand and Australia, in higher proportions than those from the mother country. The issue of oil. The oil power map for 1939 was the most unbalanced of all. The United States extracted almost two-thirds of crude oil worldwide. The major American, British, and Dutch companies controlled resources in the rest of the world, in South America, the Middle East, and the Dutch East Indies. Apart from the Western Allies, the only power with enough crude oil to meet its needs was the USSR, whereas the Third Reich and Imperial Japan suffered shortages. In September 1939, Germany only had enough stocks for a few months' active operations. In 1940, stocks all over the Reich and across occupied Europe were supplemented by Romanian oil. Synthetic petrol from coal, which Hitler had made the main focus of his self-sufficiency policy, peaked in 1943, providing 40% of Germany's fuel requirements. The production-consumption balance, already fragile, collapsed in May 1944 when the American air offensive destroyed the synthesizing plants. Japan was in an even more precarious situation. In 1940, its national resources only covered 8.6% of its needs. The war could only continue because Japanese forces took control of the oil wells in the Dutch East Indies, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo early in 1942. However, U.S. submarines stopped these products from being taken back to Japan. The 1941 German invasion did not affect the Soviet Union's oil potential, and the damage caused by Hitler's second offensive in the summer of 1942 was not serious enough to jeopardize its motorized forces. The position of Great Britain was extremely precarious. Since it was highly dependent on imports, 99%, the booming demand for fuel for aircraft and ships had to be covered by massive imports from Caribbean and South American oil fields, as well as exports from the USA. This made protection of the transatlantic routes a constant worry. As for the United States, not only could it meet all of its military and civilian needs, it also managed to increase exports to its allies. The oil situation was one of the most obvious factors behind the defeat of the Axis. Figure 1. Changing energy needs. The massive scale of the change in energy requirements during the interwar period is apparent from just two figures. In 1918, an American soldier needed 15 kilograms of supplies every day, including 1.2 kilograms of fuel. In 1945, he needed 33.5 kilograms, including 16.5 kilograms of petroleum products. Figure 2. World crude oil production in 1939. German and Japanese war leaders were well aware of the enormous imbalance in oil resources, which can be seen in the table below. But they based their plans on the hope of fast victories that would give them access to additional resources. Soviet oil for the Germans and Indonesian for the Japanese. However, the Germans had not expected to have to supply fuel for their Italian allies and the conquered economies. Figure 3. The Allies, masters of the oil game. The U.S. oil industry achieved the unlikely feat of managing to supply civilian consumers, subject to some rationing, meeting the enormous demands of the Allied forces 36 times higher in 5 years, and stepping up exports to its allies, chiefly Britain. Both the British and the American situations illustrate the huge energy demands of a large navy and strategic bombing planes. By 1945, RAF consumption was 42 times higher than it had been in 1938, and that of the Royal Navy 10 times higher. Figure 4. The Reich's Quest for Oil, 1938 to 44. When Germany went to war, it had one asset, its synthetic fuel industry, and one ambition, to gain control of Romania, Hungarian, and Polish resources as quickly as possible. The map bottom right shows Germany's unrealistic strategic plan that was considered at the beginning of 1942. A wide-ranging dual movement around the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, aimed at taking control of 20% of the world's oil resources in the Caucasus and in the Middle East. By attacking Germany's synthetic fuel plants, American B-17 and Liberator bombers, accompanied by Mustang fighter planes, forced the Reich to survive precariously on its reserves. Figure 5. The USSR, the world's second largest producer under attack. Part of the Reich's second strategic offensive in the USSR, Operation Edelweiss, was a deliberate attempt to take over the oil fields of Maykop, Grozny, and Baku. Maykop was taken, but Soviet engineers rendered the wells unusable. Panzer troops came to within 30 kilometers of Grozny, and the Soviets set about wide-scale destruction in anticipation of a German takeover that ultimately did not occur. Preventative dismantling in Baku also explains the 45% drop in Soviet production in 1943. Nevertheless, what was left, supplemented by U.S. supplies, was still enough to meet the Soviet Union's main military requirements. Arms production compared, 1939 to 45. The Reich, the Allies' main economic and technological opponent, lost the industrial battle in 1943, just as it mobilized all its resources and those of occupied Europe. Its belated efforts merely delayed its defeat by 6 months. Its three main opponents had assets it did not possess. Their arms production was complementary, so that each could mass produce what it was best at. Despite the issues that remained, particularly in the USSR and Britain, they were not short of raw materials and labor. They had top quality equipment, especially transport, aircraft and combat ships, explosives, artillery, and radar. Their production sites were protected from bombing from 1942 onwards. The Americans had every advantage. They were leaders in all key areas of production, aircraft, ships, trucks, and explosives, and could afford to equip all their allies, including China and France. The Soviet arms industry had led the world until 1937. They focused on heavy equipment, tanks, and artillery. In other areas, trucks, half-tracks, communication, and detection equipment, they were generally weak. The Germans were outclassed in volume in the field of explosives, artillery, and means of transport, but they maintained their superiority in number of tanks, infantry weapons, and submarines until the end. However, since they had to manufacture every type of weapon, they were constantly faced with the problem of taking from Peter to give to Paul. Their allies had too narrow an industrial base. Italy was totally unable to live up to the promise of millions of bayonets boasted about by Mussolini. The Japanese made great strides with aircraft and ships, but their technology, unlike that of other fighting countries, did not improve during the war. Figure 1. Production of ground-based weapons. The Allies manufactured 5 times more tanks than Germany, although this does not mean they always had 5 times more on the battlefield. A large part of their production was used to replace losses. 4 Allied tanks were destroyed for every German tank, making up for quality with quantity. The same was true of artillery, at least on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht compensated for the lack of launch tubes by more effective firing, but that advantage was cancelled out by Britain and the USA. The German forces had no shortage of machine guns, machine pistols, and portable anti-tank weapons until 1945. In fact, their Panzerfaust was the envy of their opponents. The USA was far ahead of the rest of the world with the automobile industry, and had been since the beginning. It supplied twice as many high-quality trucks, 3 times as many command cars, and 5 times as many tanker lorries, ambulances, and radio cars as the rest of the world. The 102,251 tanks manufactured by the Soviets were also an achievement, planned before the war. The idea was to create dual-use factories producing both tractors and tracked vehicles. For instance, the Chelyabinsk factory, built to make tractors, 11,000 a year in 1939, gradually shifted to tanks between 1940 and 1941. In 1944, it produced 4,720 IS-2 and heavy assault guns, mobilizing 50,000 workers, including 2,500 specialists evacuated from Leningrad and Stalingrad. Figure 2. Munitions production. The Soviets were outstanding in the field of munitions production during the Second World War. Although Imperial Russia had only produced 10% of the shells made by the Kaiser's Germany, the USSR was on an equal footing with the Reich, despite its underdeveloped chemicals industry. The Allies' average volume of fire was 3 times higher than that of the Axis over the whole war, but in 1943 it was 4 times higher, and in 1944 5 times higher. The obstacle for Germany was a lack of steel and non-ferrous metals. By 1944, its artillery units were facing rationing. By the eve of Operation Bagration in 1944, the situation was dire. The German Army Group Center only had 70,000 rounds in reserve, compared with the 1 million of its Soviet opponents. Figure 3. Aircraft production. In 1938, the three Axis countries were manufacturing 3 times as many aircraft as their future adversaries, and often of better quality. This gave them a sense of power that helped to fuel their aggression. By 1940, they were producing no more than half as many aircraft as their opponents, then a quarter in 1942, rising to a third again in 1944. The stagnation of British and Soviet capabilities enabled the Germans and Japanese to catch up to a degree, but this was limited by the huge scale of U.S. production. In 2 years, the U.S. built or updated 30 massive factories, the top 4 of which produced more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. The most productive was the North American Aircraft Corporation in Dallas, assembling 18,874 aircraft. For the Germans, there were 2 hidden factors behind their increased production. Firstly, most of their budget was spent on fighter planes, at the expense of bombers and transport aircraft. Secondly, labor and energy were allocated to aircraft factories rather than to ground-based equipment. On the Allied side, since the USA could supply every type of aircraft required, the British were able to focus on producing fighters and strategic bombers. The Soviets withdrew from the latter sector and instead concentrated their resources on tactical bombers, mainly the Ilyushin Il-2 Stromovik, 36,183 produced, and the Yakolev Yak, 31,000 produced. Figure 4. Shipbuilding. It was in the shipbuilding industry that the disproportionate nature of war production was most marked. The Axis countries more or less stopped building battleships and cruisers in 1941, with Germany only manufacturing submarines and Japan building only destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. With their 1,141 U-boats, German shipyards launched 3 times as many submarines as all of the Allies combined, this specialization giving them the same qualitative advantages as the Americans had in the Pacific. Britain and the US stepped up production of escort ships and destroyers because of the need to watch over the thousands of convoys crossing the seas in all directions. The 141 aircraft carriers built by the United States more than made up for the loss of 12 of them. With its heavy losses, 6, and in spite of a few new launches, from 1943 onward the Japanese Imperial Fleet was completely outclassed in quantity and quality, disappearing in 1944. A large part of America's naval efforts were dedicated to building 64,550 landing ships of all kinds, resulting in around 30 successful amphibious operations in Europe and Asia. Their number, variety, landing ships, smaller landing craft and landing vehicles, and complexity were such that the timing of operations partly depended on their production rate. If D-Day had not succeeded, it would have taken at least a year to begin again, purely because of the loss of several thousand of these specialized craft. The cost of manpower. Both sides faced the same formidable challenge. How could production be increased when 25 to 40% of the male population had been mobilized? There were 3 possible solutions: finding new sources of labor, reassigning manpower to factories, or increasing productivity, but not at the expense of agriculture and services. As far as the latter were concerned, the public sector workforce increased disproportionately as state control increased. The Reich had a shortage of manpower from 1939 onwards. Early rearmament had forced it to redeploy its surplus manpower to the war effort back in 1935. With agriculture still relatively unmechanized, 8 million people were needed to work on the land, restricting movement from the countryside to the towns. Industry had difficulty increasing its production rates up to 1944, with the Army demand for soldiers and manufacturers being slow to reorganize production, so that skilled male workers were kept in the factories. The UK was more efficient and encouraged subcontracting. Thousands of small firms, even telephone betting services, were switched to the war effort, but it too faced a shortage of manpower. In 1941, it began mobilizing men and women from the civilian population, which Hitler only did gradually. However, this was a difficult process. Fewer than 50% of women were recruited, and there were so many manufacturing orders that army conscription had to be restricted. The situation was different in the United States, which had a pool of 23 million people not in employment, the unemployed, women, and minorities. Taylorism, modeled on the motor industry, resulted in enormous productivity gains. The USA could afford to use staff carefully and increase internal consumption 3%. The USSR was in a serious situation. The invasion and mobilization had deprived it of half its manpower at a time when the Red Army needed mass recruitment to make up for the terrible losses. Salvation came from an extraordinary recovery plan with the clever use of Stalinistic mobilization and coercion, relying on basic equipment and inhuman sacrifices. Agriculture production was halved and reserved for the urban population and the armed forces. Their rations were one-fifth the size of British rations, forcing the rural population to live in abject poverty. The standard of living, already very low, fell by 40%. It is not clear why the system did not collapse in 1942, but it produced results. In 1943, the Soviet arms industry was twice as big as that of Germany, but at a huge cost. By 1945, Soviet society had been bled dry and was constantly haunted by the threat of famine. Figure 1. New sources of manpower. The Americans, unlike the Germans, had an inexhaustible pool of labor, the unemployed and women, as well as minorities blacklisted by industry. It is a cliché that German women stayed at home while American women were modeling themselves on Rosie the Riveter. In fact, 57% of German women, 9/10 of them single, were working in 1944, compared with 43% in Britain and the US. Hitler took advantage of the Weimar Republic's feminist social policy. To assume that 1.5 million were unproductive because they were classed as domestic workers ignores the fact that the figure included 96% agricultural workers. The misconception is due to the invisibility of many female German, Japanese, and Soviet workers who were employed in agriculture, which siphoned off manpower, whereas in Britain and America it was mechanized. However, the Reich, unlike the USSR, failed to mobilize the remainder. In 1944, 8 out of 10 Soviet farm workers and 1 in every 2 manual workers were women. To compensate, Germany drew on forced labor by prisoners and subjugated civilians. By 1944, these represented 1/5 of the workforce, but German manpower was continuing to fall. Figure 2. Changes in the working population. In 1939, British economists divided industries into 3 categories. Group 1 was the war economy: steel, engineering, chemical. Group 2 was considered essential to the nation: agriculture, administration. And Group 3 was deemed less essential: building and public works, trade, banking. However, these classifications did not fit Soviet society, which was fully militarized even in the field of agriculture. They do show the ceiling quickly reached by German mobilization, the gradual optimization of the USA and the UK, the huge role of Russian and German agriculture, and the major changes in the USSR, sustainable only for a few months, and then only with the help of the Lend-Lease Act. Figure 3. Productivity, the aeronautics industry. Allied superiority in this field was based on numbers. By 1944, the US had 4 times as many workers as the Germans working on engine and assembly. But productivity was also higher. They optimized every area of production, remembering that they were all closely interlinked. For instance, the disadvantage of a low-skill workforce was remedied by the use of scientific management principles. The Axis still used workshop-style facilities requiring skilled labor with no assembly lines. They were hampered by military demands and, by 1944, facing difficulties due to shortage of raw materials, Allied bombing raids, and sabotage by forced labors. The British Empire at war. From June 1940 to June 1941, Britain seemed to be alone in the war. But this was an illusion. Although the British Isles were set apart from the European mainland, Britain could rely on its colonial empire, a superpower that in 1939 controlled a third of the Earth's surface and a quarter of its population, around 484 million people. It is true that 70% of these were concentrated in India, the Raj, which at the time covered present-day India and Pakistan. This jewel in the crown had been destabilized by independence movements since the end of the 19th century. The situation was worsened when the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, declared war unilaterally without consulting local political leaders. Nehru was sympathetic to the Allied cause, but Gandhi refused to take part in the conflict. He was arrested on 9th of August 1942 and released for health reasons on 6th of May 1944, while Subhas Chandra Bose raised an army for the Japanese. India nonetheless remained loyal and supported the Allied war effort. Despite the injustices and huge human cost, local defense spending multiplied ninefold between 1939 and 1945. In 1945, the incompetence of the colonial powers caused a terrible famine in Bengal, in which between 1.5 and 3 million people died. Despite all of this, however, Indian troops went to fight wherever the empire needed them, not only in Burma and India, but also in Africa, Syria, Italy, Greece, and elsewhere. Beyond the Indian subcontinent, the British could also call upon the Crown Dominions, former colonies to which the British government had granted virtually equal status. These made a vital contribution. Half of the pilots in the Empire's Air Force were trained overseas out of reach of the Luftwaffe, mainly in Canada. The Royal Canadian Navy helped to escort convoys in the Atlantic. Its fleet was increased from 6 escort ships and destroyers in 1939 to 193 in 1945, making it the third largest in the world. Figure 1. The economy. Britain might have been a major industrial power, but its gross domestic product was still smaller than that of the Empire, which was a vital source of raw materials for the Allied cause, especially metals for alloys and rubber. The seizure of oil wells in Iraq and Iran in 1941 made up for the apparent shortage of crude oil. Support by ships from the Empire gave Britain control of 30% of the world's merchants' tonnage. Britain's dependence on the Commonwealth explains why in 1941 and 1942 Churchill was particularly preoccupied by the war in the Atlantic. Figure 2. Population of the British Empire in 1939 in millions of people. The combined populations of the United Kingdom and the Empire gave Britain a demographic power equaling that of China, the most highly populated country in 1939, with 520 million inhabitants, far exceeding the USSR, 168 million, and the USA, 131 million. This was a world war, and the Empire did not escape. Although the territories invaded by the Axis in Egypt and India were very sparsely populated, this was not true of Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore, with its most important naval base, and Hong Kong, which was under Japanese control from the end of 1941 to 1945. Figure 3. Unequal mobilization. Although it relied increasingly on female workers, 27% in 1939, 39% in 1944, Britain was forced to leave at least 10 million working men for the war economy, so it had to start conscripting from the Empire in 1939. India contributed the largest number of troops, but the majority of these were deployed locally. Only 11% of its ground forces were sent overseas, compared with 83% of New Zealanders, as its casualties reflect, and slightly over half of Canadians and Australians. The latter were a key part of the forces fighting in Africa from 1940 to 1942. U.S. military aid, the Lend-Lease Act. On March 11, 1941, after a vote in Congress, President Roosevelt passed the Lend-Lease Act, one of the most important acts of the Second World War. Its signing, which effectively revoked the Neutrality Act and the Cash and Carry Act of November 4, 1939, returned the USA into the arsenal of the Allies. The act allowed the President to sell, transfer, rent, or loan war equipment or any other goods to any country whose security was vital to the United States. Its original purpose was specifically to help Britain, which was on the verge of bankruptcy, and its dominions. It was extended to China in April 1941, to the USSR on November 7th, to the French Committee of National Liberation in November 1942, and eventually to some 40 other countries. Between March 1941 and September 1945, aid from the United States to its allies totaled $49 billion, 17% of their expenditure on the war. This was all the more generous in that it was given at the same time that the USA was rearming its own armed forces, and often in competition with this. Over 47% of the aid was military equipment, 22% industrial products, 12.8% food products, 13% services, and 5.2% petroleum products. The lion's share, $30.7 billion, 62% of the aid, went to the British Empire, followed by the USSR at $11 billion, France at $3.2 billion, and China at $1.6 billion. The British received nearly a quarter of their food from the United States at $4.2 billion. The Soviets were second with $1.7 billion worth of flour, fats, tinned meat, sugar, powdered eggs, and milk. Most of the machinery supplied also went to those two countries. The USSR received $1.5 billion out of the total $2.4 billion, the British $0.8 billion. The figures below relate to the military items provided under the Lend-Lease Act. In the USSR, these were supplemented by British and Canadian equipment. 4,542 Matilda and Valentine tanks, and nearly 7,000 Hurricane, Tomahawk, and Kitty Hawk aircraft. Although this equipment was inferior in quality and quantity to U.S. equipment, it had the huge advantage of arriving quite early in 1941 and 1942, when the Soviets had not yet managed to make up for their losses. Figure 1. Rates of delivery in millions of dollars. U.S. supplies of military equipment really took off in the last quarter of 1942. Before then, they had mainly been for the British Army, with U.S. ammunition and tanks making a difference at El Alamein in November 1942. On the other hand, the United States played no part in the Red Army's Moscow victory in December 1941, and very little in its Stalingrad victory. The French army was completely rebuilt in Africa with Lend-Lease equipment from early in 1943. Figure 2. Breakdown of aid in millions of dollars. The military aid was very diverse, high in quality, standardized, and supplied with maintenance equipment and a stock of spare parts. It included thousands of items, some made to measure for a particular ally. The strength of the U.S. aeronautics, automobile, chemical, electrical, and electronics industries, all with more than 50% of global production, is clear from the following figures. Figure 3. Sum of the equipment supplied in units. U.S.-made aircraft and tanks represented a year's worth of British production, and trucks 2 years' worth. In 1944, 20% of the weapons used by British forces were American. The equipment sent to the Red Army greatly improved its mobility, Studebaker trucks and jeeps, and its command and control systems, radio, telephones, from 1943. The Marston mats enabled Soviet aircraft to cope with mud and take off more frequently. While the 10,000 flat wagons speeded up the transportation of tanks to the front, the 1,955 locomotives made up for almost all the suspended production of rail engines. Like corned beef, U.S.-made boots remained an emotive for Soviets who lived through the war. Figure 4. Who received aid? The British Empire 68% and USSR 26% were by far the biggest recipients of US military aid and of industrial, mining, and food aid. Britain monopolized 80% of the aid for the empire because of the close strategic relationship between Britain and the USA and the need to prepare infrastructure in Britain that the US Army and Air Force would require when planning for D-Day. The equipment sent to Chiang Kai-shek's China did little to improve the performance of his forces. Some of it was reappropriated by the communist forces. Thank you for listening to this snippet of World War II infographics. This video carries you through page 39 of the book, about midway through chapter 1. If you enjoyed listening, please let me know in the comments and I may be able to continue recording more of the book. Thank you for listening.